Good morning. You can probably tell we're not camping anymore. We're back home. Glad to be home. It was nice to sleep in the air conditioning, a little bit cooler than it was at the campsite, but we had a really good time. And I'm really glad to be here with you this morning. I'm Nate Borman, one of the pastors at Mount Lebanon, and here to share a devotional thought with you. Today, we are walking back through and just kind of doing an overview of Daniel chapters 1 through 6. Over the last 2.5 weeks or so, we've been reading through Daniel 1 to 6, and I just want to help you see something and understand something quickly about the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel is 12 chapters long, and it's organized this way. Chapters 1 to 6 is a narrative. And what I mean by that is it's a story. It's the historical account of what happened over a long period of time to four men, to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So the early chapters of Daniel chapters 1 to 6, is a narrative account. It's the narrative account of what was going on for them as they wandered and as they walked in captivity. First under King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, then under his son King Belshazzar, and then under the Medes and Persians under King Darius. We don't actually read this part of the history within the book of Daniel, but Daniel actually lives all the way until the Medes and the Persians are gone, till Darius is gone and another King Cyrus is. So Daniel actually lives throughout the entire 70 years of captivity. So that's Daniel chapters 1 to 6. The second half of Daniel that we're going to start tomorrow is really, it's still Daniel, but now Daniel, it in a way it takes a turn, and now we hear about some of the dreams and the visions that Daniel had. We're gonna walk really slowly, maybe even you might call it pain. It might even be painfully slowly through the next chapters. Because what you have, and this is probably what people enjoy about Daniel. We know Daniel most for the lion's den and the fiery furnace. But I think what people get excited about most in the book of Daniel is the visions. Because the visions of Daniel 7 through 12 are very much like the visions of Ezekiel, are very much like the visions of Revelation, where you have beasts. And I won't say more because I want you to keep reading along with me. We're going to start Daniel chapter 7 tomorrow. But before we do that, I want to just take a moment and talk to you a little bit about, maybe draw a couple of conclusions from this narrative that God has written down for us, the story of four men, of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and of Daniel. And there's two things I want to share with you today about, maybe two lessons. One is that faithfulness to God is never easy, but God's faithfulness to us always looks easy. Faithfulness to God is never easy, but God's faithfulness to us always looks easy. I want you to think about this, first of all, from the side of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were called to be faithful to God, to never turn away from Him. And there were all kinds of circumstances in which, that we read about, in which it would have been easy for them to be unfaithful to God. And yet you see, and this is amazing to me, what you see from these four men is that under pain of death, under threat of death, they refused to bend or give in and be unfaithful to God. First, it was the food. We shouldn't eat these things, so let's come up with a different arrangement. Then it was the idol. Are you going to bow down to this idol or not? What are you going to do when there's trouble? What are you going to do when the law of the land is you can only pray to the king? Right? Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It was not easy, and I think it's important to understand that this is not just one little bit of time that we're covering in the book of Daniel. We're actually covering decades of history. So Daniel, it's easy to remain faithful for a short time, but these four men, they're called and they have to be faithful for an entire lifetime. Faithfulness to our God is never easy, and I think you can experience that, and you can understand that. It's easy to be faithful to God for a moment, but when it comes to being faithful to God for a lifetime, that's much, much more difficult and much, much more challenging. Faithfulness to God is never easy, but God's faithfulness to us always looks easy. And I think that's the thing that emboldens and strengthens our faithfulness. We can be faithful to God because we know that in any and every situation, God is and always will be faithful to us. He will never turn away. He will never turn his back. And in fact, as often as we sin against him, God still, this is Paul to Timothy, if we are faithless, God remains faithful because he cannot disown himself. So even in our faithlessness, even when we stumble and fall, even when we are not faithful to him, God remains faithful to us. And we see that in the account of Daniel. We see God's faithfulness. He gives them favor with the chief of the care of the four guys when they first get to Babylon. We see that as God walks with them, as God sends someone to walk with them in the fiery furnace. We see that when God sends an angel to shut the mouth of the lions and the lions, and God is faithful to his people. And you need to know that God is going to be faithful to you. And when we talk about God's faithfulness, that means that God is true to who he is. And God is always true and steadfast with his people. He will never turn his back on you. Now, that's one thing I want you to see. Faithfulness to God is never easy, but God's faithfulness to us always looks easy. And because that's who he is. Our God is always faithful to us. And the second thing is that humility is a huge thing before our sovereign God. God wants his people, God wants all people to humble themselves before him, because he alone is the sovereign. I want to read to you real briefly from James, because that's one of the messages that James leaves for his people, writes in his letter. This is James 4, verses 7 through 10. He says, "Submit yourselves then to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come near to God, and he will come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Grieve, mourn, wail. Change your laughter to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up." You see, God wants us to humble ourselves before him. A phrase that's come to my mind as I think about humility is, sometimes we think about the world and we describe the world like it's our oyster. And I actually looked this up yesterday because I wanted to make sure I was using this phrase, the world is our oyster, in the right way. Basically what this means when we talk about the world being our oyster is that the world is ours to grab and seize and take out of it what we will. And that's just not a biblical way, a scriptural way of looking at our lives. The world is not our oyster. Actually, the world is God's oyster, and we are his pearl. And you understand how that works with a pearl, right? How an oyster takes a pearl, it's grinding off the rough edges, it's smoothing everything out, so what comes out of this oyster is this beautiful pearl. And what God is doing throughout the book of Daniel for these four men, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and for the kings, and for all of Babylon, for all of the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians, is God is seeking to humble them. God is seeking to refine them. God is seeking to make them pearls. Right? The world is God's oyster, and we are his pearls. And that's what I want you to see about what God, when you look at and consider the things that God is doing in your life. God is seeking to refine you. When God knocks you off the knees and you have to fall down before him in humility and brokenness, know this: God is not trying to destroy you. God is trying to raise you up. God knocks us down. He makes us humble. He makes us humble. He breaks us before him so that he can refine us and build us up. Because he wants us to know that the world is his oyster and that he is sovereign over it. We have, and I think that's the biggest thing about this whole book, is that we have a great God. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway of all this book. Daniel's not a book about how we should learn to be better people. This is not primarily a book about how we should learn how to follow God. This is a book about God. This is a book about who God is for his people. He's a faithful God who protects, who saves, who delivers. He's a relentless God who doesn't give up, even on kings of the earth who have refused to acknowledge his lordship and his sovereignty. This is a book about God. And we're going to see more of that as we get into a different kind of literature in the rest of the book. We're going to be looking at some visions and dreams that God gave to Daniel during his time in Babylon and under the kingdom of the Medes and Persians. We're going to continue to see some of the same things. We're going to continue to see that following God is not easy, but our God is always faithful. We're going to continue to see that kingdoms will rise and kingdoms will fall, but the kingdom of our God, it will never fall. We're going to see our faithful God at work. Daniel is a book about God, and I hope that you can see more and more about God as he lives and rules in our life. Here's my challenge to you. If you made it all the way to the end, way to go. You stuck with me to the very end. Here's my challenge to you today. In the comments, I'd love to hear your takeaways from the first 6 chapters of Daniel. I'd love to hear what are some of the big lessons that you've learned about God, about yourself, about life, about living in this world. I'd love to hear some of your takeaways. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts. What are your takeaways from these first 6 chapters of Daniel? Have a great day, everybody. The Lord be with you. He is with you, and he will never leave you. He is faithful to his people and will continue to be. He is relentless to save you. Have a great day, everybody. The Lord be with you all.